transcends Christianity.
The concept of agency in Jewish law and biblical theology is both profound and essential for understanding the communication of God's will to humanity, especially given that God's presence is often described as unapproachable, and human beings are not capable of directly experiencing God's presence in human-like form without dying. To understand how agency works, it is helpful to explore the different facets of biblical narratives and the role of intermediaries, whether they are prophets, angels, or divine messengers. The legal and theological concept of agency. In Jewish law, the concept of agency, Hebrew shaliach or shaliach tzibur, means that a person can act on behalf of another, essentially standing in for that person in order to carry out specific tasks or responsibilities. The one who acts as an agent, the shaliach, has the authority to perform certain actions as if they were the one doing it. The agent, however, is always acting under the direct authority of the principal, the one they represent. This principle extends to legal, economic, and religious spheres. In biblical theology, the principle of agency operates similarly. God, being transcendent, often uses agents, whether human or divine, who are appointed to represent his will and execute his commands. In many cases, these agents act with full authority, and when they speak or act, it is as if God himself is speaking or acting. This idea helps explain how God's will is conveyed through intermediaries, allowing for human interaction with the divine without direct exposure to God's unapproachable presence. Key biblical examples of agency. Aaron's rod in Exodus 7. In Exodus 7, when Aaron strikes the Nile River with his rod as instructed by God, the text says, "The Lord did it," Exodus 7 verse 20. While Aaron is physically performing the action, the attribution is to God because Aaron is acting as God's representative, carrying out God's command. This exemplifies the principle of agency. Even though Aaron is the agent performing the action, the ultimate authority lies with God. Moses' speech in Exodus 5. In Exodus 5, when Moses speaks to Pharaoh, it says God spoke, Exodus 5 verse 1. Moses is, in this instance, a mouthpiece for God. He is not speaking of his own accord, but as an agent through whom God's words are delivered. The idea is that God's presence is so transcendent and holy that he cannot directly speak to Pharaoh. Instead, Moses is the intermediary, and when he speaks, it is as though God is speaking directly. Isaiah's prophecy to Ahaz. Isaiah 7 verse 3. In Isaiah 7, God commands Isaiah to go and speak to King Ahaz, and the text frequently attributes the message to God, even though it is Isaiah who is delivering it. Isaiah says, "Thus says the Lord," Isaiah 7 verse 7, demonstrating that though he is the human mouthpiece, the message comes directly from God. Isaiah, as God's agent, speaks on his behalf, conveying his will to the king. The centurion and the Jewish elders. Matthew 8 verses 5 to 13 and Luke 7 verses 1 to 10. The story of the centurion asking for Jesus' help with his sick servant provides another example of agency. In Matthew 8 verses 5 to 13, the centurion himself approaches Jesus saying, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof." In Luke 7 verses 1 to 10, however, it is the Jewish elders who come on behalf of the centurion to speak to Jesus. The centurion never directly speaks to Jesus himself, but through the agency of the elders, his request is presented to Jesus. Here, the elders act as agents, representing the centurion's will. Even though the elders are the ones delivering the message, the request comes from the centurion, and Jesus responds to it as if it came directly from him. This is a clear example of how the agent's actions are understood to be the actions of the principal. God sending messengers in the Old Testament. Throughout the Old Testament, God frequently sends prophets as his agents. Consider the story of Moses in Exodus 3 verse 10, where God commissions him to speak to Pharaoh. Moses, as God's agent, is to speak on God's behalf, and even though Moses is the one speaking, it is considered that God is speaking through him. The same applies to Elijah and Elisha, who also act as divine agents when they speak God's words to Israel or other nations. Even when angels appear in the Old Testament, for example, in Genesis 18 with Abraham, they often speak as representatives of God, and their words are considered as if spoken directly by God. The role of angels as agents of God's will. Angels frequently act as intermediaries in the Bible. In Genesis 18, 3 angels visit Abraham to deliver a message from God, and while Abraham addresses them directly, the message they deliver is from God. Likewise, in Daniel 8 verse 16 and Daniel 9 verse 21, the angel Gabriel serves as God's messenger to deliver divine revelations. Jesus as God's ultimate agent. Jesus represents the fullest expression of agency in the New Testament. He is not just a prophet or an angel, but the Son of God, sent by the Father to reveal his will and offer salvation to humanity. In John 12 verses 49 to 50, Jesus states, "For I did not speak on my own authority, but the Father who sent me has himself given me a commandment, what to say and what to speak." Jesus speaks and acts as the agent of the Father. His entire mission is to make the unseen God known to humanity, and his words and deeds are presented as those of God himself. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Matthew 26 verse 39, Jesus prays, "Not my will, but yours be done," again demonstrating his role as an agent who submits his own will to that of the Father. He is fully man, yet he takes on the role of the servant agent, carrying out God's redemptive plan. Why is agency needed? God's unapproachable glory. God dwells in unapproachable light, 1 Timothy 6 verse 16, and no one can see him and live, Exodus 33 verse 20. This is because God's holiness and glory are so overwhelming that human beings cannot directly perceive his presence in its fullness. To protect humanity from being consumed by his divine radiance, God sends agents to represent him. God's desire for communication with humanity. Even though God is beyond human comprehension, he still desires to communicate with his creation. Agency allows for this communication to happen in a way that is comprehensible and safe for humanity. Through the use of prophets, messengers, and ultimately his Son, God communicates his will and purposes, making his presence accessible to people, facilitating relationship and redemption. Agency also serves to facilitate the relationship between God and his people. The use of agents is central to God's redemptive plan, as agents like Jesus and the prophets play a crucial role in bringing about salvation, establishing covenants, and guiding humanity in accordance with God's will. In conclusion, the biblical concept of agency allows God to interact with humanity in a way that preserves his holiness and transcendence. By sending prophets, angels, and ultimately his Son, God ensures that his will is communicated while protecting humanity from the direct confrontation with his divine presence. Agency also reflects God's deep desire to engage with his creation, facilitating a relationship that is both mediated and safe. This principle is consistent throughout the Bible, and its most powerful manifestation is in the person of Jesus Christ, who represents God in the fullest sense, bringing salvation to the world as the ultimate agent of God's will.
Common Sense Christianity.